Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet, and welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and I sincerely appreciate you joining me for this evening. This is Episode 2, Part 1, In the Shadows of Time, Our Lost and Hidden History. And this is just the first part of a two-part series where we are going to travel the globe and take a look at some of the most enigmatic rediscovered pieces that kind of make up the puzzle of our shared history. I think we all somewhat have that sense in us that something's missing. We're not getting the full story. You know what I mean? Perhaps we're not, being told something, or perhaps we've just forgotten it as a species, as a collective. It's just kind of slipped from our memories. But I think we all know there's a little bit more to our history than what we're being told. And I feel that is illustrated through the rediscovery of a lot of these lost ruins that we've been finding, lost civilizations that have resurfaced, some of the artifacts from these places, some oop arts, if you will, and just some of the little shreds of truth that seem to kind of be peeking out from the sands of time. We're going to start off a little bit more familiar, and some of the stuff we're going to cover in this episode may be, very familiar to some of you that are kind of the lost history buffs and are really into this kind of stuff. This probably won't be a whole lot of new information for you, but it is all things that I feel are very necessary to cover. And for people who haven't heard of some of this stuff or haven't really looked that deep into some of these things, I think it'll be very eye-opening for you, because some of this stuff makes really little to no sense when you put it into our current narrative, if you will, of our shared history. It kind of all stands out as not really making sense. But we're going to go a lot further from that too. I've got some stuff that's kind of hopefully going to blow a few minds before we get done with this. Some things you probably haven't heard of. Some things that took a lot of digging to actually uncover some legitimate information on. And that's what takes a whole lot of time for this show, to be honest with you, is the research. I don't ever just find one story and then run with a single source on anything. I double fact check, triple fact check, compare sources. I make sure that the stuff that I bring you guys is as accurate as I possibly can get. So that is why we are running a little bit late this week, and why we're putting this episode out on Friday rather than the usual Wednesday. I endeavor to try to get next week's episode out on time. We're going to try and shoot for Wednesday next week. If in the off chance it doesn't happen, then we're going to have another incredibly dense episode probably, and it will also come out next Friday. But it's going to be back-to-back, Part 1, Part 2, and then the following week we're going to do a BTR. So we'll get caught up on everything, go back over stuff, add a little context, discuss some things. Hopefully you'll interact in the meantime and have a little bit of a back and forth about some of this, so I can know your thoughts and meet you in the middle with some things. But in order to get there, I feel that it is important to understand the official story as we know it at this point anyway. In order to challenge the narrative, like we love to do on this show, first, it's really important that we understand what that narrative entails. So, we're in for quite a journey tonight. Go ahead, grab a passport, or just pour a drink and buckle up as we take a little trip through history. Starting off this evening with our prelude, which is just a brief history of our species according to mainstream archaeology. Modern humanity, or Homo sapiens, is typically considered, as far as the fossil records go anyway, to have officially began around 200,000 years ago, with our emergence as an anatomically modern human being traced back to Africa during the late Pleistocene era or Upper Paleolithic. Some of the key elements signifying a change in our species, aside from the changes in our appearance and build, this is when it is believed that we first began using symbolic language, advanced tool-making techniques, social organization, and where we first began to produce art. According to official records, things continued in this manner, with small, scattered groups, typically just families or small groups of families, surviving as mostly nomadic hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, all the way up until what is known as the Neolithic Revolution, starting around 10,000 BC to be more precise, with the beginning of agriculture, which led to larger populations and permanent settlements. As the domestication of crops and animals allowed for larger groups to flourish and to begin to see the rise of small cities during that period, from 8,000 BC to around 3,000 BC. This led to social hierarchies starting to kind of form and the beginnings of political structures. This would really get going, however, during the Bronze Age, starting in 3000 BC, when the first recorded use of mankind combining copper and tin to create bronze for tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects is first seen. And this was a huge step. It really can't be downplayed just how significant us going into the Bronze Age was, according to mainstream archaeology anyway, because this enabled us to do a whole lot more, and this is kind of where our evolution took a big step up from where we were. This would continue to improve societies and capabilities, and it led to the rise of the early major civilizations, like think of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and the Aegeans. From about 1200 BC up until around 500 AD, or CE if biblical connotations and 1500 years or so of tradition bother you, we would enter the Iron Age, which would see the widespread adoption of iron for tools and weapons, leading to significant advancements in agriculture, warfare, and trade. And this would give rise to some of the major empires of history, because this was kind of like the empire period. And of course we're talking about like the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, Romans, and even the Han Dynasty in China. Next would come from 500 AD to 1500 AD is what would be considered the Classical Era. And it would be broken down into two major periods. There's the Late Antiquity from 500 AD to 800 AD, and the Medieval period, which I'm a huge fan of, from 800 AD up until about 1500 AD. Of note from late antiquity is the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of new political and religious powers. The medieval period is characterized by feudalism, the spread of Christianity and Islam, and the development of the centralized monarchies in Europe, as well as the Crusades and Camelot and knights and all that stuff. That's kind of all within that period. This takes us into the early modern era of 1500 AD to 1800 AD. With the Renaissance period, and a revitalization of art and intellectual revival in Europe, which is when you see, the Sistine Chapel and Da Vinci and some of the greatest minds and artisans, kind of coming to the forefront and really creating some tremendous works of art that have lasted to this day and are still impressive. This was all happening during that Renaissance period. It was probably a fantastic time to be alive. A lot of people had it a lot better then. It was definitely a step up from the feudalistic system that came before it, and enabled a lot more people to kind of enjoy a decent lifestyle. From there, we would move into the age of exploration, and I think we could probably more appropriately call that the age of colonization, That takes up the latter half of that. The modern era would begin officially in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, bringing rapid industrialization, urbanization, and technological advancements, which would transform economies and societies around the world. Then we come into our modern globalization in the 20th century, and that runs all the way up until today, for better or worse. This is a loose and broad picture of the official narrative of humanity's past. This story is similar to the one that you would learn in school or read from virtually any textbook that you'd pick up or historical tellings the world over. It's been reaffirmed and reinforced by countless historians, museums, and records for decades. But is it accurate? Better put, is it complete? Or are pages missing, perhaps entire chapters omitted for the sake of preserving the perceived integrity and accuracy of the institutions we have been taught to trust implicitly and consider them infallible? Well, that, my friends, is precisely what we will endeavor to put our curious little minds to work together tonight to attempt to understand. Regardless of your thoughts on Graham Hancock, he has said one thing that has really stuck with me, and that is that we truly are a species with amnesia, kind of alluding to the fact that we seem to have forgotten our true history in its entirety, if you will. Perhaps it's equally fitting to say that it has been obscured, hidden, deliberately or otherwise, to kind of preserve the narrative history and maintain control of our shared story. It's beginning to border on the absurd to continue to deny the mounting evidence of lost history, though, and to just hide away every artifact that they can that would refute the official story we've been told. While I'm not sure I can give you a precise answer as to why this is seemingly being done, I would like to at least present to you just some of the most compelling evidence to indicate that this could be the case, in hopes that perhaps together we can try to piece together a little more of our story. My job isn't to tell you what or how to think about things. It's simply to encourage you to do so. And hopefully, every once in a while at least, I'm actually successful at that. Now we move into part 1 officially. The past comes knocking. Virtually every great civilization throughout history has at one time or another been swallowed up by the sands of time and been forgotten. So what I would like to try to cover with you all this evening is how some of these civilizations have resurfaced, as well as how many of them don't seem to really fit with the official narrative of our history, as well as some of the ooparts or out-of-place artifacts that have also been discovered that either don't make sense according to the official narrative or even completely dispel its possibility altogether. One thing that is crucial to understand is that what we consider our official history is little more than a story that's been pieced together by various archaeologists and agreed upon. Oftentimes this is based solely on little more than the opinions of each individual archaeologist, or whoever makes the discovery. And then they try to piece it together with other agreed upon conjecture in order to make it fit together in this nice little puzzle to make the overall story. There is no such thing as a definitive record of our history. Know that. Only what has been done during modern times, just in the hopes of trying to understand what actually came before. And with that in mind, I want to start with an example of a lost civilization, one long believed to be simply fictional, but truly served as a jumping off point to the seeking and subsequent rediscovery of ancient lost civilizations in modern times, and was essentially the birthplace of what we consider to be modern archaeology. Though the search for the lost city of Troy has been ongoing for a few thousand years really, or since shortly after its fall around 1180 BC to be precise, for much of that time the Iliad, an epic attributed to Homer around 750 BC, stood as the single record of its existence. Or at least it was up until 1872. Businessman turned adventurer Heinrich Schliemann was no archaeologist, at least not by the standards of the discipline. He was just a man, armed with a copy of the Iliad and a fierce determination. In 1868, he set out to the Greek island of Ithaca, where he decided to look for the palace of Ulysses. While unsuccessful really in that attempt, it led him to continue to follow the path laid out by Homer and to travel inland from the Marmara Sea into Turkey on a quest to rediscover Troy. At that time, there were 3 locations that were lead candidates for the location of Troy, but he decided to settle on Hisarlik. Well, at least eventually, after not finding any success elsewhere. This would be where he would cross paths with Frank Calvert, and while the whole story is quite interesting, though highly convoluted, the point is, they would end up working together and would begin excavations in 1870. It wouldn't be until 1872, however, when Schliemann would find a roughly 3-foot-high wall, which led to uncovering the ruins of an ancient city. Schliemann came to the conclusion that these walls had once been part of the fortifications for Troy. He would go on to uncover a cache of gold and artifacts and then attributed them to Priam's treasure, and declaring that this was indeed the lost city of Troy. It would later turn out that those actually belonged to a civilization about 12,000 years before Troy, as this site actually has about 4,000 years of history and inhabitants. He was, however, correct about Troy, and his efforts are widely considered to be the starting point of modern archaeology, and definitely its public recognition. Since then, civilization after civilization has been dug up. From the Minoans to the ancient Egyptians to Mayans, history has continued to rise from Earth and change our views of events. Really, only in the most recent of times has mainstream archaeology band together like this to set a narrative that is unflexible and beyond the scope of questioning. So, let's question it a little bit, shall we? Which brings us to part 2. This story falls apart. As of late, a plethora of ancient sites have begun to accumulate to the point that it has begun to be speculated by many that highly advanced civilizations, lost to time, disasters, and great floods, existed and thrived all over this planet well before our current timeline of history would indicate. Our timeline would have you believe that mankind created virtually nothing prior to the Ice Age, but increasing preponderance of evidence would say otherwise. What it seems to indicate, rather, is that human civilization has, in the distant past, risen to great heights of engineering and possibly even technological advancement, only to be swept away by disasters and subsequently began again. That there are many lost chapters of our shared story, long forgotten outside of scattered legends and unexplained ruins and myths, all which echo from our distant past and beg us to remember. And while many of these ruins are hotly contested, some whose true antiquity are very difficult to prove, a site would be unearthed in the 90s that would force mainstream archaeology to reconsider its rigid date range, and would push the dating of mankind's architectural, social, and religious levels and development back by several thousands of years. Sticking with another site in Turkey for now, and there are several more, this time in the southeastern Anatolia region lies one of the most compelling sites of recent years. Klaus Schmidt, German-born archaeologist and prehistorian, guided by local farmers while looking for archaeological sites in the region, came upon a hill that for generations had been in use by local inhabitants for agriculture. While some tools had been previously discovered here, no true work had been done at the site. Many before Klaus had mistaken what would later be discovered to be the upper parts of T structures as just simple grave markers. But having found similar structures in the past, Klaus felt that there was much more to that story. So, a year later, in 1995, he would begin excavations at the site that are still ongoing until today, despite him passing away back in 2014. What they would uncover is a massive site, containing the oldest dated megaliths in the world. Large circular structures with massive stone pillars, decorated with sculptural reliefs, well before this technique was really even known to exist, with anthropomorphic detailing of animals as well as other ancient domestic structures and some small buildings around the site. It appears to have been used as far back as 10,000 BC, up until about 8,000 BC, when it was possibly buried and intentionally covered up around 1,500 years later, or just fell into disuse and forgotten, buried under a mudslide of sorts. I'm of course talking about Göbekli Tepe, which means Potbelly Hill in Turkish, and it's a description of its mounded nature. While first believed to be strictly a ceremonial site, current excavations interpret it more as a settlement of sorts, with various stages to its development. Journalist and highly contested amateur archaeologist Graham Hancock has put forth that its creation involved accurate astronomy and the invention of agriculture, which indicates its origin coming from a sophisticated and advanced ancient civilization, or at least the remnants of one that were largely destroyed through a great cataclysm during the Younger Dryas period, 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, which he believes was likely caused by a comet's impact. This, of course, is a claim which has drawn the ire of mainstream archaeologists the world over and caused a massive backlash against his work. Whether you choose to believe Hancock or the mainstream, the fact remains that Göbekli Tepe is the first irrefutable proof of humanity being at least somewhat more advanced, much earlier than it was ever believed to be. Remaining in Turkey for just another moment, central Turkey this time, the Nevşehir province to be more precise, is what is known as the Cappadocia region, where in 1963, a man doing renovations to his basement would knock down a part of a wall with a sledgehammer and uncover a previously long-forgotten world. As he struck the wall that fateful day, he slowly began to realize that there was a void behind it. Continuing to pound away at it, he opened a space large enough to take a look at what lay beyond in the darkness. Retrieving a flashlight, he peered inside to discover it was some sort of a tunnel. Making a hole large enough to climb into, he would discover that this tunnel led not to his neighbor's house like he probably suspected, but to more tunnels, and rooms, and even more tunnels, and even more rooms. All totaled, he would discover a massive underground city, about 20 stories, dipping down to at least 280 feet in places, with enough rooms to house an estimated 22,000 people or more. There is definitely no shortage of potential builders of the site, or that it's been attributed to over the years, but in reality, no one truly knows who carved out this massive underground city, and since stone can't be accurately carbon dated, and no organic material has been found that could reliably be attributed to the original inhabitants, no one knows for sure when it was carved out either. This is a local legend in the area of a lost underground city where previous inhabitants had returned in order to hide from the invaders at various times throughout history, but until that fateful swing of the hammer in 1963, it was thought to be lost and possibly only a myth by the people that live there now. This isn't that big of an anomaly for this area, as the local residents have been carving out underground houses in the soft volcanic rock for centuries. However, there isn't anything near the scale of what has been found down there, the full scope of which is still being excavated. But as of right now, they have discovered at least 5 miles of passageways, with a highly advanced ventilation system comprised of at least 16,000 shafts to bring fresh air to even the deepest levels of the massive complex, as well as its own water supply through underground rivers, wells designed throughout to bring fresh water to every part of the city. It's easy to see why it is an attractive place to hide and to fend off invading threats. There are rooms for all the needs of a city, including shops, bakeries, wineries, dining halls, churches, schools, places for pressing and storing olive oil, libraries, huge storage areas for food, and places to store grain, as well as horse stables and areas for livestock, including the butchering, curing, and storing of that meat. This underground fortress of a city has multiple surface entrances that have been discovered, allowing for the local inhabitants throughout the city to flee there from all over the surface city, with narrow entrances to prevent invaders from rushing in. But even if they did, each entrance and several of the main tunnels throughout are equipped with giant circular stone doors weighing around 1,000 tons each that can be easily rolled into place, but only from the inside, allowing them to effectively seal off the whole thing in sections if need be, should enemies make it inside even, as well as areas above the doors that would allow for the defenders to shove spears down through carefully designed slits to kill invaders from above while still remaining protected. There were also tunnels for escape, including one to Kamakli, another underground city about 4 miles away. And if you haven't figured out where I'm talking about just yet, we're talking about Derinkuyu. Kamakli may actually be a part of Derinkuyu, or just a failsafe. While it is still under excavation and still in the early stages of it, there are some who say that it could turn out to be even larger in scale than Derinkuyu. Archaeologists have even speculated that there may be more like this, or even an interconnected series of underground cities all throughout the Cappadocia region. There are Greek inscriptions on some of the walls, as well as a few other languages, and evidence that several cultures have occupied and even expanded this complex over time, but no definitive proof to indicate who originally created this massive complex, or any of the others that are still being discovered. What can be definitively said, though, is that it is yet another piece of our shared history to resurface over time, and further helps to shatter our previous misconceptions about the level of advancement and abilities of ancient civilizations. It truly is a mind-numbing place to visit. Nothing parallel to it, outside of this region, has ever been found. It really is just a massive fortress underground, and it's something that I would highly recommend everyone taking a moment after this to look up and look at some of the images of it. Look at the doors. Those are incredible. The engineering that it took to get that 1,000-ton or better cylinder into these places where one person could move this door into place from one side, and then it's completely impossible to open it from the other, which is why parts of this place are still closed off, and they have difficulty to fully excavate everything that's there. It's definitely worth taking a look at, and I thought it should be on this list. But as interesting as these last few locations have been, they aren't completely impossible to explain away as just slightly ahead of their time, or just an anomaly that was previously missed but could still possibly, somewhat reasonably, be shuffled back into our official historical timeline. Outliers, certainly, but only that. In order to start finding things that truly stand out and potentially shatter the paradigm of established history altogether, we have to dig a little deeper, metaphorically speaking. In our first example of a place that might just fit that bill, we take a little trip to Micronesia. We're way out in the Pacific Ocean, around 621 miles from the nearest remote thing to a coastline, sits one of the strangest lost ruins ever to be rediscovered. Perched atop a coral reef and a series of man-made islets, 92 of them to be exact, with interconnected canals that are also lined in stone, that have earned this place the nickname the Venice of the Pacific, sits the enigmatic ruins of Nam Madol, which means within the intervals. Constructed with an estimated 750,000 tons of basalt at least, which archaeologists have suggested was transported by bamboo rafts and canoes from various other islands, though repeated attempts by multiple groups trying to prove this theory have yet to be remotely successful, even with smaller stones than were used for any part of the construction at Nam Madol. Some of the basalt blocks there weigh as much as a massive 50 tons, and compose walls as high as 58 feet tall and as thick as 17 feet, making Nam Madol one of the most astonishing megalithic sites on Earth, and the only ever known to have been built atop of a coral reef. It's a floating city, guys. When I say on top of a coral reef, I don't know what that really draws to your mind, or if you think that this is just up here or something, but you really need to look up pictures of this place. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it, but I just wanted you to kind of get in your mind really how incredible it is that they have all of this ridiculously heavy basalt stacked and built and positioned, not even talking about the cutting and coring, but on top of a coral reef, so that it's basically just floating off the edge of Pompeii, which is where it is. Not to be confused with Pompeii, this is Pompeii. Carbon dating from the site originally put the time of its construction around 1180 AD, and it was attributed to the Sundalese dynasty, who ruled that island of Pompeii at that time until they were overthrown in like the 1600s or so, and that site is believed to have been abandoned at that point. However, more recent independent studies of the site have claimed dates as far back as the 2nd century BC and even beyond. Even if it were constructed in the late 1100s by the Sondeliers, no stone quarries exist in the vicinity, and these absolutely massive basalt stones and columns would have to be transported to the site somehow, as well as lifted and fit perfectly into place. A lot of the times with no gaps at all, nothing you could put a razor blade or a sheet of paper through. It's another one of those sites. In order to construct the numerous buildings, walls, and stone-lined man-made canals, all by people without any modern equipment. A feat that, mind you, would be virtually impossible even with today's technology. Or, these people didn't even have the assistance of pulleys and levers. Virtually no mechanical assistance whatsoever. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Sondeliers were the people who were responsible for its construction. At its peak, the entire population of the island of Pohnpei, which Nanmadol, as I said before, kind of sits just off the coast of, is estimated to have only been around 20,000 to 30,000. And that's including children and elderly and women and other elements of their society that weren't contributing to the hard physical labor parts or were unable to. And this is on a remote island that could barely support day-to-day needs of those inhabitants, let alone support them for an undertaking as massive as what would be necessary to have built this place. It's been estimated by the Smithsonian that given the number of available working age inhabitants of the island, Nanmadol's construction would have taken them more than 3 centuries. According to the oral history of the Pohnpeian people, which was a very weird word to say for the record, and I'm amazed that I got it on the first try, Nanmadol's origin story begins with a group of 7 men and 9 women who set out from somewhere across the ocean looking for a new home long, long ago, way back in the distant past. During their journey, hold on to your seats folks, they met an octopus spirit who directed them to an unknown island in the Pacific, but it turns out it was just a trick, and when they arrived, the island was no larger than a canoe. Luckily though, these travelers possessed magical powers, which allowed them to raise the rest of the land from beneath the waters, where they settled, building a stone altar in the middle and naming the island Pohnpei, which meant upon a stone altar. Over centuries, 5 more groups arrived to the island, each bringing a secret magical knowledge of how to move mountains, raise reefs, and shape the island. Eventually, a 7th group arrived, which brought the mightiest sorcerers yet. 2 brothers, Olasipa and Olasopa. It was these brothers who built Nanmadol by using their powers to fly the huge basalt stones through the air as if they were weightless and stacking them into islets, canals, walls, and buildings. So powerful was their magic, these brothers conquered Pohnpei, founding what would later become known as the Sondelier dynasty. While that story obviously sounds pretty crazy, some have suggested to look a little more closely at the part about levitating the huge stones through the air using some sort of magic, and how this kind of parallels with stories of levitating large stones that are found around the world, suggesting that the story might not be myth at all, but in reality, the folk memory of some sort of lost technology that is in some way relating to geological electromagnetism or even acoustic levitation, which is made slightly more compelling by the fact that many researchers have reported that stones there have magnetic properties. While some basalt may contain magnetic minerals like magnetite, basalt is naturally not a magnetic stone. A great deal of its buildings and walls were constructed of basalt columns, stacked in alternating rows as one would build a log cabin basically, with columns as long as 20 feet and weighing a mind-numbing 80 to 90 tons, and stacked, as I mentioned, up to 58 feet high. These stones are cut and fit into place so precisely that no mortar was used or even needed in its construction. Yet it has weathered for centuries, at least, and would be extremely difficult or even possible to build today, even with all of our modern techniques. All that considered, it's easy to see why Namadal stands out as one of the most impressive and enigmatic megalithic sites to ever be discovered on the planet, and how it directly challenges our preconceived notions regarding the technical capabilities of past civilizations. And this really is a place that is incredible to see. Those of you that are familiar with Namadal, you probably know what I'm talking about. There's a number of different documentaries that you can watch to kind of get an idea of what this place looks like, but it's unbelievably impressive. Just the degree and skill of the craftsmanship and how they could possibly have done all of this and built basically this massive floating city. And some of these pieces of basalt, like I said, they weigh up. These are basalt columns. They weigh up to like 90 tons, estimated 90 tons. How did you float that on a canoe? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. There's not any easy answer as to how this place was constructed. It really forces one to kind of question our official history and narrative and how technologically advanced we believe these old civilizations were, which is a theme that we're going to continue to do throughout this. But again, this is one of those things, jot it down, put it on a list. You need to go check out Namadal if you're not familiar with it. And now for a little bit of fun, and for our next compelling look at a possible lost or hidden history. Maybe. Let's travel a little closer to home for the most of us, and back to the US for just a moment. Because in 1908, when President Roosevelt was working really hard to declare the Grand Canyon completely off limits to any kind of commercial use, so that's timber, mining, anything like that, and it was later designated a national park, but this was just before that. So this guy, G.E. Kincaid, as all of the name that we were given, I guess he felt like this was his last chance. He needed to get in there and see what he could find. Gold, there are lots of valuable minerals in that area. Anyways, he takes a boat down the Colorado River and up through the canyon to see what he could find. About 40 miles upriver from what is called the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, Kincaid started to notice these stains up in the settlement. So this drew him in, and curiosity got the better of him, so he paddled his boat to the nearest shore and tied it off so that he could go investigate. While he wasn't able to find a noticeable trail, after a short hike he was able to come across something more useful and compelling. Hidden within the desert brush, steps. Hundreds of steps, in fact, were carved into the yellow sandstone, which wound their way up to a shelf high on the side of the canyon walls. Intrigued by this discovery, he decided to follow them, making his way up to a cavern that was tucked away from sight by anyone coming through the waterway, and from above. Once he reached the entrance to this cavern, he saw that there were stains of different colors that were emanating from within the cavern and flowing out along the ground, and that the entrance bore the marks of chisels and appeared to be distinctly man-made. He knew that he needed to investigate this further, but he wanted to have proper lighting and the necessary equipment and tools. Sensing he was a little bit over his head here, he decided to leave for the time being and make a couple of phone calls, requesting that someone of authority in the archaeological world would come to assist him in his investigation. That call was answered, allegedly, by the Smithsonian, who would then dispatch one of their researchers, a man going by S.A. Jordan, and there are hundreds of conflicting accounts as to what their actual relationship really was, if Kincaid worked for Jordan to begin with, if the Smithsonian actually funded like the whole thing and sent them down there. There's no shortage of people that have a different telling of this whole thing. But to make a long story a little shorter, what is for sure is that on April 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette, which was, I guess, as legitimate as any other newspaper of that time, which we will talk about more in just a bit, ran a story on the front page titled Explorations in the Grand Canyon. Mysteries of immense, rich cavern being brought to light. With Jordan is enthused. Remarkable finds indicate ancient people migrated from the Orient. The article would go on to explain that G.E. Kincaid made the initial discovery and was joined by Smithsonian scientist, the bar was pretty low back in those days, S.A. Jordan, to study what was described as wondrous labyrinthian honeycomb of man-made tunnels filled with seemingly eastern treasures of golden urns, sophisticated copper tools, ancient artifacts, hieroglyphics, mummified remains, and statues, whose iconography resembled those common to Hindu or Egyptian cultures. This article articulates every piece of the event, even the location of the cave's main entrance, which is 5 miles north of Grand Canyon Village on the south rim, descriptions of hieroglyphs in detail, as well as accounts of them finding armor, copper instruments, pottery, and figurines. And it also talked about an incredibly large statue that sat in the main underground passage of the cavern that looked Asian, but had Egyptian symbols on the base of it. Deeper into the passage was a room that held Egyptian-looking mummies, which I feel like I said really weird for some reason, not important, that were stacked 3 high. Each had been leaning on their own tier or shelf of its own with a small copper cup and like items near its feet. According to most written accounts, Kincaid and Jordan gathered all the loot that they could and loaded it onto their boat, and then sent it on to the Smithsonian Institute, which is a big mistake, regardless. It's since been added to over the years, with others saying that a second exploration was undertaken only to find the cave had been blasted and its entrance destroyed to prevent any further exploration. Many have pointed out that many of the canyon's formations are named after Egyptian temples and deities, such as Tower of Ra, Horus Temple, Osiris Temple, Isis Temple, Tower of Set, and so on and so on and so on. There's actually a ton to this story, with in-depth descriptions of all the amazing things found in what Kincaid and Jordan would allegedly come to dub the Citadel. However, for the purposes of this episode, and because, honestly, nothing outside of those 2 stories in newspapers printed during the height of yellow journalism, which yellow journalism is kind of like a term used for some of the salacious and oftentimes made up or elaborated on stories, a lot of exaggeration. That time was sort of the wild frontier, I guess, of journalism. And this was just shortly before or right at the time that the first college of journalism, or it was actually taught as a profession and started being taken seriously. Before that, it was kind of just a wild cash grab, and the crazier story you could find, whether you had valid sources for it or whatever, you wanted to run with it, because the more eyes you could get, the more money you could make, obviously. And it was a different time for journalism. Not saying that current journalism is to be implicitly trusted by any stretch of the imagination, but there were a lot of hoaxes and things during that time. I'm not saying that I think for sure that all of this was made up. I don't know. And a lot of things there that have been sealed off and locked off with crazy metal gates and giant locks and stuff. And of course, there's whole sections of the canyon that are just off limits, where you'll see those nefarious black helicopters, and they've been repeatedly filmed by explorers who wandered a little bit too close to the area. And considering it is one of many interesting things alleged to have been discovered here in the United States, I just kind of felt that it was worth discussing at least. It's always been a story that I've found interesting. I won't completely dismiss the possibility of at least something similar going on in that area. I think it's very interesting to think about, to talk about, to look into if you'd like. If that story interests you, a great resource and one of my favorite YouTube channels ever, the Y-Files did a pretty great episode on it. He goes a lot more in depth with everything that they found, and kind of tells the story better than I would. I wasn't really trying to necessarily make that a story. I kind of just wanted to talk about that because it is a compelling and strange little piece of lost history, if you will, right here in the United States. But for now, I'd like to move on for the moment and head on into our last little piece for today, in one of the most interesting places that I could possibly ever talk about, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia. Around 1470 AD, the Incan people came across a mysterious and ancient site high up in the Andes Mountains, which had been abandoned many centuries before their arrival. They felt that the site was so ancient that they believed it was the place where the world was created, and that the site itself was built by the gods. The site lays near the highest navigable lake in the world, and my absolute favorite one to say, Lake Titicaca. Yes, that's actually the name of the lake, which is also the largest lake in South America. The Inca would name this enigmatic and mysterious site Tiwanaku, and would revere it as a place of great religious significance. The site, which remains currently, covers around 4 square kilometers, but since I live in America, that's just shy of 2.5 miles or so, and is comprised of many structures and terraced platforms, all which seem to show astroarchaeological and archaeoastronomical, good God, alignment, which is just a very difficult way of saying that many features of the site seem to align with astrological features like in the night sky, the sun and the moon's movement through the sky, and shows intention within the construction, different uses to track like the seasons and the passage of time. But the exact age of the site has been hotly contested for decades, when Austrian explorer and the pioneer of like Andean archaeology, basically, Arthur Ponansky, first performed a modern study of the site back in 1926. He put forward the idea that it was one of the oldest archaeological sites on the earth and dated back to at least 13,000 BC. Archaeologist Neil Steed, who was employed by the Mexican government for like 11 years and was an archaeologist who was designed to help determine the age of various sites, and among other jobs that he had for them, visited the site in the 90s alongside the director of Bolivian National Institute of Archaeology, Oswaldo Rivera, and both of them concluded that Tiwanaku was at least 12,000 years old. Much of this work was done by taking the features of the site, which were clearly aligned to the sun or other celestial alignments, but were just off alignment, and then essentially rewinding the night sky, if you would, using charts until they fell back into perfect alignment. For those unaware, the tilting of the Earth and its axis is in relation to the plane of the solar system. It changes as it goes from like 22 degrees in 1 minute to 24 degrees in 5 minutes at the max, and that happens across a 41,000 year cycle. By calculating this variation in relation to the point that it aligns the site's features, some believe that archaeoastrology can be used to determine the age when the site was created. While it has been successfully used in some instances, it isn't considered an official discipline within archaeology and has been largely dismissed by many in mainstream archaeology. However, it's also fair to point out, mainstream archaeology has gotten it wrong their fair share of times as well. Still, there remains frequent tension between the two camps. Regardless of its exact age, which has varied from long before the last ice age, all the way up to as recent as 500 AD, this site contains numerous interesting and seemingly out of place, or out of time, anomalies. For instance, its construction, whenever it occurred, is a complex and highly unique mystery in and of itself. It is generally agreed that the stones used in its construction, some estimated to weigh between 26 to 131 tons, or way more depending on who you ask, with some researchers even putting forth weights as unbelievable as up to 800 metric tons, were quarried at 2 separate sites, with the larger red sandstone blocks coming from about 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles away, and the smaller andesite, which are still incredibly heavy, coming from a quarry a staggering 90 kilometers or nearly 56 miles away. both trips requiring a difficult jungle trek uphill, all by people without even the assistance of any sort of a wheel. One of the most incredible areas, though located just under a mile away, but also believed to be a part of this massive complex, is Pumapunku. The name translates to gate or door of the puma. Like Tiwanaku though, these are names given to the site long after their construction by the Incas. Pumapunku is a man-made terraced earthen mound, 549 feet wide along a north-south axis and 383 feet long across the east-west axis. Its eastern edge is occupied by a 22 by 127 foot stone terrace paved with enormous stone blocks, including the largest stone slab found at both of the sites, and it is a staggering 26 feet long, 17 feet wide, and conservative estimates clock it in at a weight of at least 144 tons. And remember, archaeologists have concluded the enormous blocks were transported up a steep incline from a quarry 6.2 miles away. Each of the H blocks, as they are referred to as, something you just have to see to understand really, making up the outside walls, were cut with laser precision. And that's not an exaggeration. When you see them, you'll understand. And fit together in an interlocking fashion, fitting together like a massive puzzle, almost. Like Legos, in a way. The precision these blocks were cut with, and the highly accurate angles used, create perfectly flush joints, and is indicative of a highly sophisticated knowledge of not only stone cutting, but also descriptive geometry. A concept that wasn't officially understood broadly or published in any written accounts until about 1525 AD, long after the latest dates proposed for this site. To say the construction techniques used at the site were ahead of their time is embarrassingly inadequate. The precision of the cuts and fitment of the rectilinear andesite blocks, which is one of the hardest stones on Earth, just about the hardest for the record, suggests the possibility of prefabrication and mass production. And this is like legitimately a mainstream consideration. They don't know how this was done. But those are both techniques that wouldn't come along for at least centuries after this. No tools have ever been recovered or identified that were used in the construction of Tiwanaku, leading many, even archaeologists, to believe that the builders must have possessed tools the likes of which archaeology has no record of, that were greatly advanced in comparison to anything else that they do have a record, signifying that nothing short of some type of lost technology could have been responsible for the level of craftsmanship that's found at the site. Among other interesting architectural features of the site is what is referred to as the Wall of Humanity. Along the sunken courtyard's walls are tenon heads, which refers to how they are mounted to the wall by the use of a tenon, which is basically like a peg type extension that fits into the wall, and it secures these carved heads, each one representing the facial features from multiple different civilizations. Tenon heads are actually a somewhat common feature in Peruvian temples. However, these are unique to this region and represent virtually all races, including some that admittedly do kind of resemble gray aliens. While I'm not a believer in the aliens built Pumapunku theory, I do admit that there is some interesting evidence out there for those who are looking to find it. One of the most interesting features of the site, aside from the massive gates that seemingly defy explanation and the mysterious H blocks that we just talked about, is the use of what is called architectural cramps. These are loosely eye-shaped pieces of metal which are actually poured in a lot of these cases into carved out spaces in this shape, which mirroring side to side, so it joins two stone blocks together and secures them into place. One of the many things about this site I would encourage you to look up in order to better understand what they actually look like. In some of the areas, they were also believed to have been just hammered into place as well. while this ingenious technique, or something kind of similar to it, typically a T-shaped clamp, is also found at other ancient sites around the world, such as Korinkancha and Ollantaytambo, which took about 3 tries to get right, ancient Egypt, and in Greece. These are made from a unique copper, arsenic, nickel, bronze alloy, though, which is distinct to this region. In my opinion, this is but one of many things that makes Tiwanaku and Pumapunku exceptionally unique among ancient sites and forces us to reassess our beliefs in regards to the level of advancement among ancient civilizations. I could honestly go on and on just about this site alone, and believe me when I tell you that we have really only barely scratched the surface of this incredible example of ancient engineering. However, I would strongly encourage you again to go and take a look and research it for yourself, because that's truly the only way to really appreciate the scope and scale of this accomplishment. Even though most of it has kind of crumbled and eroded away, and gone are its polished metal plaques and brightly colored ceramic and fabric ornamentations, even though what remains is truly but an echo of its one-time glory, it still remains yet another whisper across time that calls into question that perhaps we truly are a species with amnesia, as Graham Hancock has put it, and if we aren't still a long way away from truly understanding our shared history on this planet. With that, we wrap up part 1 of this journey through time. I'll be back with you next week, though, for part 2 of this series, and we still have some really incredible and crazy stuff to discuss. Some of the best, actually, in my opinion, is still yet to come. I know that parts of this episode, by the way, were very dense, and the second half will have a little bit less of that, though. And I'll be opening up a little bit more and giving you my thoughts on a bit more of it, as we go along. If ever an episode warranted your thoughts, I think this one could be a strong contender for that. So please check out the Q&A and the poll over on the Spotify episode page. Go to the info. It'll have underneath the episode description, you'll see the Q&A, and then there's a poll. There's also, leave me a voice message. I love to check those. And let's discuss this, because I think that this is one of those things that it probably has a whole lot of, strong opinions. I know that everybody has their own take on the ancient history and the lost civilization stuff. I know it interests a lot of people. I've had several people that suggested I do this episode, and it's one that I've wanted to do since I first started doing this podcast. So I feel like this would be a good spot to jump in if you haven't already and join in the conversation. And whatever you guys leave me, I'll address all of it on the BTR that's going to follow the week after next. Like I said, we're going to do part 2 next week, and then after that, we'll be doing the BTR kind of on both of them. So, as always, thank you guys once again for joining me for another episode. I will talk to all of you again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.